Thank you. Okay, and if we go to the next slide, our agenda today consists of the following items. So first, we'll have a brief welcome and introduction section, followed by a process update on what we've covered so far with the task force and where we're headed next. Then the city will share some information on extremely low income housing developments and facilitate a discussion with the task force. There will be some community engagement updates and discussion, as well as discussion of the mobile shower and laundry pilot that the city has been partnering on with, we hope. And then we'll wrap up and cover a few next steps before concluding this evening. And we are the Homebase team, myself, Joy, Carla, and Eli. Homebase is a nonprofit that works with communities to support their efforts to end homelessness. And we're here today as neutral facilitators of the task force. And we're excited to be with y'all today. And we do have a packed agenda. So in the interest of time, we're gonna breeze through our introductions a bit more quickly today. So we won't be asking folks to come off of mute and introducing themselves, but I'll just quickly provide some intros to city staff and our task force members before we get started. But folks are welcome to say hello in the chat if you'd like. So with that, we'll start off by acknowledging the City of Santa Clara team that is present today. We're joined by Adam Marcus, Housing and Community Services Division Manager, Sergeant Gregory Degger of the City of Santa Clara Police Department, and Jennifer Carvalho, Staff Aide of the Housing and Community Services Division. Next, we also wanted to acknowledge our task force members who have represented the community thus far. The task force is a group of community members and system partners working to give feedback and advise the city on issues related to homelessness throughout this process. So we thank you for being here with us today. And next, I'll go through some Zoom norms for our task force members. So we'd love to see your faces. If possible, please turn on your cameras so we can see who all is here with us today. If you have a question or comment, please use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen before coming off mute, or also feel free to use the chat function. And as a reminder, the task force session will be recorded and later posted on the city's homelessness task force webpage. And if you're experiencing any tech issues with Zoom, you can please feel free to send a chat to one of the Homebase team or contact us at our email, cityofsantaclara@homebaseccc.org. And quickly for attendees, we encourage you to please use the Q&A function to submit a question to the facilitators. The Q&As during this meeting will be moderated, so questions from the public will be received and answered as time allows today. We may not be able to answer every question, but we'll be reviewing them for themes in different focus areas. So we'll be able to take your questions and feedback down that way. Once again, this session will be recorded and later posted for you to view. And if you're experiencing Zoom issues, you can feel free to chat one of our team directly, and we'll be happy to help you out with that. Next, we've provided a starting place for discussion guidelines and norms. And generally, we encourage folks to speak from their own experiences, engage in respectful discourse, and be as present as you can during today's session. And on the next slide, we have the goals of today's meeting. So our team will provide updates on the planning process. We'll be exploring extremely low income development within the city and discuss feedback from the community engagement process to date. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to my colleague Carla for our first section on process updates.
Thanks so much, Joy. So before we get into sort of the meat of today's meeting, we were hoping to sort of reflect on where we've been, where we're going, and kind of put, everything into context, especially the conversation that we're going to be having today. So next slide, please. So to reflect on like the task force meetings, right? So during the first task force meeting, which feels like a very long time ago, I'm sure to everyone, we spent some time reviewing some data on homelessness in the county and the city of Santa Clara. And we set group values and goals for the task force. We identified that the role of the task force is to really figure out what is working and where the gaps are, and then to brainstorm, prioritize, and in the end, make recommendations to the city about what needs to be done to reduce homelessness and its impact in the city of Santa Clara. During our second task force meeting, which took place in May, we talked about the homeless system of care as a whole and the various types of homelessness programs and services that make up the system. And we identified types of programs and services that the task force wanted to prioritize for further discussion, including street outreach programs and support for folks that are living outside, shelter and other temporary housing programs, and the need for more affordable housing, which have all kind of informed, the topics of discussion that we've had over our next few meetings. In Task Force Meeting 3, which was in June, we had a really robust discussion about street outreach services. So we covered basic needs and peer outreach services. We covered behavioral health, crisis response, and medical outreach. We covered PD outreach. We also covered housing focused outreach. And we really leaned in on the expertise of our panelists, many of whom actually serve on this task force, right? And we discussed what each type of outreach aims to accomplish and the specific needs for outreach in the city of Santa Clara, such as additional resources to support connecting folks to behavioral health services and respond to crises. Then in Task Force Meeting 4 in July, we discussed shelter and other temporary housing models, which included low barrier emergency shelters, interim housing and bridge housing, which are temporary housing situations that are really designed to provide someone with housing as they wait for a more stable housing situation. We also talked about hotels and motels that were being converted to temporary housing during the pandemic. And we also talked about safe parking programs. This discussion really placed shelter and temporary housing within the context of the entire homelessness system of care, and included discussion of some notable challenges that some of these program models face, like the relationships that some of these programs have with the larger community, right? And then finally, we come to today, our fifth task force meeting, where we're going to be discussing affordable housing development in the city with a focus on housing for extremely low income households and supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. We're going to aim to provide an overview of what's currently available in the city, as well as some challenges that housing developments may face, and have a solutions-focused conversation about how the city and its partners can ensure that a housing development is actually successful, both for the residents of the housing development and also for the surrounding community. Next slide, please. So kind of reflecting on our community engagement thus far. So in addition to the last couple of meetings, we've provided kind of updates on additional community engagement to inform the city's plan, which of course remains ongoing. We held several focus groups and spoke with different groups, including community members, people with lived experience, which we did as recently as this week, and my colleagues will talk about that. We also held several focus groups with city staff and service providers. We're also going to be engaging the business community in a survey that we'll be sending out to get their feedback. And we also recently engaged with the greater community during the community forum event on August 9th, which we're going to reflect on. And at that meeting, we received really great and robust amounts of feedback, which, like I said, we're going to be sharing in a little bit later this meeting. Does anyone have any questions about sort of what I've covered so far about where we've been? All right. So to where we're going, what's next? We wanted to remind folks of what's coming up. So we have one more task force meeting left, And we're actually planning to take the month of September off and actually reconvene in October. The reason for this is because we wanted to take some extra time to review what we've discussed so far and all the input we've gathered from the community and from the task force. And then in October, we're going to discuss what the task force sees as priorities for the city's plan and what strategies or action steps should be recommended to be included. The city and home-based team will then work on putting together a draft plan based on these recommendations and community input, with the goal of having a draft plan to be shared at public hearings this fall. Does anyone have any questions about these next steps? Anne, yes.
So I just want to be sure that the public hearings on the draft plan happen after meeting 6, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so that the task force and there's going to be some input before it gets reviewed generally. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that the slide here says date to be announced, but actually we do have a date. It's October 27th, and but don't worry about that because I will touch on that during the wrap up today. So you'll have the date and the registration is already on the city's website. So you're able to go ahead and register for that meeting. So of course, that means that September we're not having a meeting. So just wanted to emphasize that. All right. If there's not any more questions, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Adam from the city so he can jump into our conversation about housing development in the city and we can begin our discussion there.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Thanks again for coming. We're almost there, second to last meeting. So thank you for staying with us and for seeing this through. We wanted to look at extremely low income housing development in Santa Clara because that type of housing serves people who are experiencing homelessness as well as people who are on the verge or at most at risk of becoming homeless. So it's really important to look at this at a slightly larger scale than, say, just shelter and interim and supportive housing. Next slide. So who needs extremely low income housing? Well, this is not an exhaustive list, but I think you know, it's good to start somewhere and we can always add to it. Minimum wage workers, you know, for a household of one would be making less than the amount of money required for to be extremely low income. Single parents and or family care providers, large families, survivors of domestic violence, seniors on fixed incomes, veterans, persons with disabilities, of course, persons who are unhoused, and more. Next slide. And in addition to thinking about who, we should also talk about how many people in Santa Clara might qualify as extremely low income. And so this is a slide from our housing element, our draft housing element, where we're looking at a lot of different housing data. And the one number that I wanted to highlight for you is the 5,462. That's over 12% of our community is extremely low income. Now that doesn't mean everyone is precariously housed. It may be that some of these folks are housed. It just means that if you know, for those who are not housed, it's going to be extremely hard for them to not pay a large amount of their income towards housing here, given the rents that we have here in this area. Next slide. So what exactly does extremely low income mean? And the next two slides start to talk about that. So this is pretty straightforward. So as you know, we measure affordability in terms of percentage of area median income. So that's AMI. And so the first chart on the left, annual income, shows for different household sizes. So if you have just yourself or you and one other person, you know, household of one, household of two, these are the highest incomes you could make to be considered extremely low income. So for one single person, they would have to make $35,400 per year or less to be considered extremely low income. in Santa Clara as of this year. And that does change year to year. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it changes slightly by household size. So if you're a household of 4, it would be a slightly higher number. And the second chart to the right is what rents are allowed to be charged to somebody who is extremely low income if they're in an affordable housing development. And generally speaking, not spending more than roughly 30% of their income. And these are the rents, again, that would be needed in Santa Clara today to be considered affordable for someone or household earning those incomes. So again, for let's say a 1-bedroom apartment, that's a little over $1,000. For a 2-bedroom, 1,137, and so on. You can see and imagine these are much lower than what market rates are right now. Next slide. And I know this is a lot of numbers, but really this is just to show that the definition for extremely low income changes every year. And from 2014 to 2022, the median income for our area, for our county, went up by 59%. And when that number goes up, that means the whole scale shifts to the right. So all of the definitions for affordable housing got higher income levels. And so what used to be considered extremely low income for a household of 1, where the threshold used to be 22,300, it is now over 35,000 for the same sized household in 2022. So this is just to show you and to acknowledge what we've been hearing from our planning commission and from other constituents, that the definition of affordable is important and it changes. And we need to really be precise in how we talk about affordability and what specific affordability is needed at a given time for a given population. Next slide. So generally, there are different types of extremely low income housing. You know, the more I'd say common types would be multifamily apartment buildings. They may be geared towards you know, low income workers, families, or there may be projects that have a focus on seniors, 55 and over, 60 or even higher sometimes. Or a mix there, you know, with both seniors and families in the same building. And more recently, as our Measure A and our county has led the way with Measure A funds, we now have many more options that are kind of burgeoning from those opportunities. And so we now have housing with supportive services. And so aside from being low rent, there's also very intensive case management services and additional support services offered on site, and meeting rooms, and the actual design of the buildings is even a little bit different to accommodate some of these on-site services. And some of those types might be a single room occupancy, hotel, transitional housing, which we'll talk about. We'll see an example of that in a minute, permanent supportive housing, group homes, and care homes, which sometimes can look like single family homes. And we do have a few of those here in Santa Clara. Next slide. And so here's a peek at Santa Clara's housing pipeline. These are all 100% affordable housing developments. There's almost 1,300 units in the process of either being built. Some of them are now occupied or more recently occupied just this year. The ones that are in bold are the housing developments that include some number of extremely low income or ELI apartments. So not all of these have ELI units, but we wanted to show you sort of the big picture to see that right as of now, about 306 out of that larger number are set aside for extremely low income, and a smaller number of those of that 306 are set aside are actually supportive housing developments. So those supportive housing developments would be Freebird, which is under construction. We'll be setting aside some apartments for persons with disabilities. Kiefer, 3335 Kiefer Road will be set aside for seniors and also have supportive services. Civic Center Drive has not yet been approved by the City Council. It is still under consideration for its planning permits, but they are also proposing to have some supportive services on site. The 2904 Corvin Drive development recently opened, that's Calabasas, and we will be talking about that in a minute. The Agri-Hood development does not have supportive services, but it does have ELI. The El Camino Real Bella Vista Inn is going to its first phase will be transitional housing with supportive services, and then its second phase is intended to be permanent supportive housing with supportive services. Next slide. So I had three real quick profiles to show you. This is sort of, I wouldn't say it's a regular old ELI project, because actually the Agri-Hood is very unique, but in the sense that it doesn't have supportive housing, supportive services like some of our other developments. It is focused on seniors. It's a mix of market rate apartments, but the building that has affordable units has 164 units, of which 54 are set aside for extremely low income residents. And while it doesn't have supportive services on site, they do have, as you can see, many other amenities, walking paths, gathering places, and a focus on agricultural and gardening, which is very unique for an affordable housing development. And this is located right next to Valley Fair Mall. Next slide. The next slide, some of you may be familiar with the Bella Vista Inn. As I mentioned, the first phase of the project will be to renovate the hotel in its current form and convert it into interim housing. And so that first phase would create 43 units of extremely low income housing with on-site case management and support services. Next slide. And our last case study is as an example of permanent supportive housing. So this is Calabasas Apartments on Kiefer and Corvin Street. The project opened this year. It was developed by Allied and Abode. It is primarily focused on individuals experiencing homelessness, and 80 of the 145 units are set aside for extremely low income residents. And it also provides intensive case management and other services on site. Next slide. So as we think about extremely low income, the different types of extremely low income development, it's important for us to think about what are the challenges? Why is it hard to build more of these? Why is there not enough for the people that really need it? And there's a lot of examples, and these are just some of the ideas that we wanted to share, and we definitely welcome your thoughts on what's not on the screen. But one of the challenges is that when you have a unit that is really deeply affordable, it just takes a lot more money to build and operate the project, because it's not, the rent itself is not covering all those costs. So it takes a lot more money from the state, from the city, and other subsidy sources for each unit that you build. And that funding is limited. Here in Santa Clara, the Affordable Housing Ordinance, it does produce affordable housing, but it does not produce much extremely low income housing. The city does not have a formal policy to prioritize investing or funding extremely low income development. While we do have projects that we have lent money to, as you saw in previous slides, there's no formal policy to set aside or to really prioritize that. Measure A funds have been great, and Santa Clara has been, in partnership with developers, been really able to take advantage of that program and really bring that investment here into Santa Clara. But those funds will not last forever, and they are. The good news is that they're being used up around the county, not just here. So we are going to see a lot of regional housing as a result of it, but it's not. Measure A will not last forever. The other thing is we have to find sites. A lot of times grants are, there's certain rules around getting state money. And a lot of times you need to find a location that is going to provide residents with access to the basic needs that they need. Things like food and groceries and shopping. And transit access, and ways to get to work. So these are also other things to consider when looking for sites. Next slide. Now, if we look specifically at permanent supportive housing, there may be some additional challenges that we need to consider. We do know, with our experience here in Santa Clara last year, in our discussions about White Oak Lane, there was a lot of neighborhood opposition to that specific project and that specific site. Sometimes when we talk generally about supportive housing, we hear support. And when we get to very specific sites, that's when we begin to hear more opposition. And so that's really the key is talking about specific places and looking at specific things. You know, what's nearby? What are the land uses nearby? There have been concerns expressed about security inside and around the building. Parking and traffic can be a concern. The density of the building and what's next to the building, as well as once the building is occupied, you know, how responsive is the property management to any issues that may arise or to any questions or concerns that the neighbors have as time goes on. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is that supportive housing does, in order to be successful, it does rely on a variety of services. And those services include, you know, social workers, mental health and behavioral health clinicians, and more. And so it's just really important that those be there and be fully utilized in order for the larger purpose to be met. And lastly, supportive housing can have higher impacts on both the police and fire department in terms of their calls for service. Next slide. And there are different funding opportunities, and they change from year to year. As I mentioned, we are blessed to have Measure A here in Santa Clara County. At the state level, we have there is the Home Key project, which is one of the main sources that's funding the Bella Vista project. And there is another round of Home Key that's going to be coming out later this year. Sorry, I abbreviated that. The AHSC, it stands for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Grant, and that's another grant that helps build together at the same time affordable housing with green infrastructure such as bike lanes and transit improvements. The permanent local housing allocation, that's a pretty new source, and it's kind of like CDBG in that each city it gets allocated an amount each year from the state. And that can be used to build new rental housing. It can be used for certain homelessness services and many other uses. But those are the uses that the city is looking at for HPLHA funds. The city also collects funds from market rate developers through its inclusionary program. So when new development is built, sometimes, and when commercial development is built, fees are collected. And that goes into the Affordable Housing Fund, and that's what we use to lend out to developers to help build the projects that we talked about earlier in the presentation. We do have a one-time home ARP grant that is, and I'm blanking on what ARP stands for, but it's pandemic related money that came forward as part of the response to the pandemic. And the city will be, you know, we have to create a plan to use that money. It's about 1.6 million. And there's certain strings attached and what we're allowed to use that for based on what HUD has decided that program should be. And so we will be, as part of this plan, looking at how to use the home ARP funds as part of the solution. And lastly, of course, foundations and philanthropy are also important sources for homeless services and for supporting pre-development through construction and conversion of these projects. Next slide. And so here are a couple questions we thought that might kind of get the conversation going about extremely low income development. Of course, you may have more questions, and we are definitely open to those. You know, the hope here is that we are able to really get to the bottom of it and think about how can we maximize our opportunities to build more here in Santa Clara. So one question would be, what are the apartment sizes that are needed? So sometimes what's being built isn't matching what's needed. So from your experience, in terms of what you're aware of or what may be missing, it'd be helpful to know if we need more of, more studios, more 3-bedrooms, things like that. Second question would be, what programs and services should be located inside of an apartment building, an affordable housing building, or even a supportive housing project? What should be located nearby or within walking distance? What's important to make sure that it's meeting the needs of residents and helpful? And then thirdly, how can we think about interim and supportive housing developments and think about how they can be good neighbors over the long term? And what I mean by good neighbors is, once they're built, they continue to operate as intended, and that there are minimal disruptions or impacts on the neighbors or nearby. And so with that, I think the next slide, I forget what the next slide is. I think we're just going to pause there. Yeah. So I'll hand it back to our folks at Homebase, to Joy, to take us into the discussion.
Great, thank you. And I'm gonna take on the discussion facilitation for this. So we'd love to hear from task force members, and just as usual, you can go ahead and throw up your hand, and yeah, feel free to weigh in or feel free to raise questions. Absolutely, this is a time to ask questions that may be answered by the city folks or other folks on the task force. I know we have a lot of folks in the room with experience of development of affordable and supportive housing. So definitely come with your questions, but also feel free to chime in on any of these discussion questions. I'll just be tracking to make sure that we hit all of them at some point. So go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to start us off.
I think Anne has her hand raised.
Oh, thank you so much. Go ahead, Anne.
Thanks. I do have a question for Adam. That chart that showed the funding sources, I'm curious about what's the breakout or breakdown of federal, state, foundation numbers, like percentage wise. Do you have a sense of that? And do you see that that's changing? That like you said, mentioned a few times, that funds are being depleted, so we're going to have to compensate in other areas. And what are those other, where do you see that happening?
Well, I'll answer, and I'll invite Hillary from our the Office of Supportive Housing at the county, and anyone else on the panel who wishes to jump in. My sense is that the most important program for building affordable housing remains, tax credits, and so those are administered at the state level, and those are competitive. So there's going to continue to be competition for those, and sometimes projects have to wait a round or two in order to get funded. So I think that's probably the largest chunk of sort of, I guess, subsidy money. So of course developers have to borrow money, but the rest of the money they need, they have to get from other sources. So I would say that the state has created a lot of new funding sources, and we're lucky in that there's been a surplus at that state level. So I think we'll continue to see pretty healthy state programs, but you have to go after those. You have to apply them. Usually it's developers that apply for them. I think that the area we could really grow in is foundations and philanthropy. We see examples of Cisco and some of the other large companies in the area who are really investing in affordable housing throughout the county, and I think that's an area that could really potentially grow. Some of the other things are one time, like Home ARP is only one time, and the city's affordable housing fund kind of just depends on development, so it's not a steady amount of income. It's sort of as things come in.
I would echo what Adam said, that we have seen more state funding in the past few years. Things like Home Key have really been helpful in helping us move more quickly on securing funding for developments, and also at bringing in additional sources of funds. I think that having the Measure A affordable housing bond for the past few years has really given us a lot of local control over how funding is invested for affordable housing, and it's really helped us drive the development of extremely low income housing, where before, not every non-local funding source, not even every local funding source, is focused on the ELI population, but it's such a gap in the rental housing inventory that we have locally. And so it would be really great to have more local funding to drive that, to drive us toward the types and levels, like rental levels of units that we need. I would also, to emphasize the point that Adam made about philanthropy and corporate philanthropy. The really great thing about having those investments in our local housing, affordable housing development and supportive housing system is that, and most of that is managed through Destination Home, which is a nonprofit partner. Nonprofits can move faster than government can. And so when it comes to securing a great piece of land that's really well suited for affordable housing development, like it's near public transit and not in a food desert, and all those things that you want to consider when you're developing for low income people, they are able to move faster than we can or developers can at securing those resources. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that having private funds in housing development is so valuable.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and for those thoughts. Lori, I see your hand.
Hello. So one thing that kind of like raised my eyebrows a little bit is when we were on the slide that says no formal city policy to prioritize funding for the ELI development. So here's my question. I drive into City Hall and see, Teslas in this big long row, and we have a city council that's divided, but it would be really awesome to see them put this on their agenda. So having the city council, so what can we do to get, knowing that our mayor is really into real estate and she owns a lot of it, what can we do as a person, as a team, to get something in city council to get voted on to have it on, to have programs here in the city. And my other question would be, do they just San Jose have it? Does, Fremont, San Francisco, do other places, most people have it, or do most cities don't have it? I would assume they do. And the next thing I have, so that's the first question. The next one is what programs and services should be inside. And I really think it's important to have people be good neighbors, and whether that is, there's a designated office where, if things are going down and things are happening in these, situations, that people can go there, address whatever issues there are, and then help get a good solution so those things, don't happen and we could be good neighbors. So I think that's super important.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. I can answer your first question. So yeah, other cities like San Jose, I don't know about Fremont, but they do set policy around how they spend their affordable housing dollars. And so they might have underwriting guidelines. In other words, just guides, whenever they have enough money to then go out and ask developers who's interested, they set up sort of guidelines and rules to sort of guide what they're looking for, and they can score the applications based on those criteria that they set. So that's definitely something that that can be done. It's just, the trade-off is just if you, as I mentioned before, if you more deeply fund extremely low income, it just means fewer units. So it's kind of a trade-off between how deep the affordability is and how many apartments total. And we know that there's a need across the spectrum. So I think that's kind of where, trying to balance out the needs and think about ways to build both. We have other tools to build higher, I should say, low income and very low income, but we don't have as many tools to build extremely low income. So it's, when I say tools, I mean, when we get inclusionary apartments, they are often moderate, low, and sometimes very low income. So we do have a mechanism for that, but we don't get extremely low income units very much from that.
So maybe at the end of all this, is that something that we should bring to our city council? Maybe get numbers from neighboring cities and see what they're doing, and see what we can do.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a recommendation that can be that you can put forward, and at the end of the day, the city council has to decide how best to spend the money that it has at any given time that's set aside for affordable housing. There's certain funds that can only be used for affordable housing, and so again, it becomes a question of yeah, I mean, it can be designed however you like, however it needs to be, and that's one way to look at it, is to encourage developers to come forward with some minimum amount of ELI, or even developers who are just building the whole building with extremely low income units. There's different ways to do it.
Great, thank you. Vivian, I think your hand was next.
Hi, thank you. So I want to actually respond a little bit to Lori and other questions, if I could. So I think all communities struggle. All communities have actually goals that they have to meet to fill the gap of low income at all of the different levels. And we can go into how that's set, but that's a whole nother conversation. And almost all communities have the most gap at the ELI level for all of the reasons that Adam was saying. ELI is the hardest types of units, the most expensive, and there's the biggest gap, meaning there's more people who need it that don't have it than the very low income, all the other income levels. So all communities struggle with this, frankly. The other thing that I'll say about supportive housing is that that I really think of it as a three-legged stool of three types of funding are needed to make the magic happen, right? Adam mostly talked about the capital funding, but the funding needed to build it, the bricks and mortar, the actual, that piece of it. That's absolutely needed. Honestly, it's really, really hard, and that's the easiest actually of the three stools. The next stool is the subsidy side. Usually that's project-based subsidies. So supportive housing only works because if you think about it, extremely low income people are paying very, very little rent, right? But you still have all the operating costs of that building, property management, maintenance, security, whatever you need for that building, right? So you have to come up with that gap. That's what project-based Section 8 usually does. So there's a housing authority, is that other big partner that has to come in with that. So if you set like targets for ELI, but you don't have that housing authority commitment, then you can't really build it because there's nothing to fill that gap. You can, but it's really, really expensive. And the third leg is services. So supportive housing is only supportive housing if you have services. And that's where the county comes in. The county actually is the partner that typically brings in the permanent, the services to support the building. And they've been amazing partners, and Measure A and others have helped leverage that. So it's all three. So if the city, I think we just have to be careful in mandating a city policy that can't be matched with other partners, because we're running out of vouchers, we're running out of Measure A funding, right? So we just need to be mindful of the three legs of the stool to make PSH work. And when it works, it's fabulous because it can target the highest need, wrap around people in whatever way they need to be wrapped around. But if you have a 30% building, meaning like all extremely low income and not enough operating subsidy and not enough services, that's where we run into problems, not providing the level of care that we need to, not being community like good neighbors, not keeping the building up like we need to. So we just need to be very thoughtful in that approach.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Vivian. It's really, really important context and information. Santiago, go for it.
Hi. I want to know if there's any resources for SSI recipients who are homeless, who are having kind of trouble finding that, resources actually kind of happen to the amount that they get.
Yeah, so your audio is a little bit fuzzy, but I think I caught it. Santiago, tell me if I'm misinterpreting your question. So I think you were asking, are there any resources specifically for folks who are on SSI who are having trouble finding housing that they can afford on the low amounts that they get? Is that right?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. I got my laptop and my camera shattered and my kind of messed up right now.
No worries,
yeah,
we've got you.
It. Thank you.
Does anybody want to speak to either sort of any resources that do exist specifically for folks who are on SSI or SSDI, or just generally how the sort of the federal public benefits play into who is extremely low income and I think what I've got is that in our experience, we know that typically SSI and SSDI do definitely put people in that extremely low income category. And so it's an area where like that's a population where there is this gap of affordable housing. Let's see if anybody else can jump in with.
No, I'll just mirror what I said before. Like, this is the area like you absolutely need the subsidy because, Adam, do you remember what a 30% rent level would be? You had that chart up.
Yeah.
By itself.
For a one bedroom, a 30% rent is $1,011.
Right. So that's 30% income, right? So how much is SSI? Y'all know that, 950, 1,000, somewhere around there, depending on. So like someone on SSI alone can't even afford at the lowest level of affordability, right? So that's why you need that operating subsidy, because they won't even qualify for the unit because they won't have enough income to sustain it. So, that's why that subsidy is so important.
Yeah, and I would also say that this is such a critical service need for these folks, because these people who cannot increase their income, like many of the rapid rehousing programs require people to be able to increase their income. Many of the folks on SSI and SDI, they cannot. It's way outside of their bandwidth for either health reasons, mental health reasons, physical reasons, whatever it may be. So we need to provide those supportive vouchers and services for them to ensure that they're able to get an affordable home that is safe and dignified.
Thanks. Go ahead, Hillary.
Thanks. I think this conversation for me sparks it reconnects me to thinking about how we engage with the community plan to end homelessness and how our recommendations align. As a task force member here, I've heard a lot of interest in helping meet people's basic needs and getting people connected to housing as quickly as possible. And I wonder if there's a place for us also to think about the things that put people in precarious housing situations in the first place. Like when the SSI program was first developed, it was actually enough money for people to afford their basic needs. But now the payment for somebody who has been deemed by a medical professional to not be able to work isn't even enough to put a roof over their head. And the supply of subsidized roofs over people's heads isn't enough. And so as we think about the recommendations that we're making, I hope that we can make recommendations in multiple areas, because it's like, if we moving on just one front alone isn't going to solve the problem that we've been tasked with solving. And now I will step back off the soapbox.
Thank you, Hillary. Yeah, it's a great reminder that, you know, one tool, one approach, one project is not going to, it's not going to do what we all want and need it to do. Go ahead, Anne.
Regarding your specific questions here, the first question about what's the ELI apartment sizes most needed, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but one of the things that keeps coming up and that came up at the community forum was this idea of, you know, like shared housing. And it implies that, you know, rather than having individuals live in a one-bedroom apartment, you know, is it more affordable to build, to make multiple rooms and then find roommates and share the space and share things? So it, you know, intuitively, it seems like it's a cheaper endeavor to have a 2-bedroom for multiple people and share the space than it is to have 1 bedroom for one person or whatever. So it just seems like there's an economies of scale there that has to be considered when we think about what's needed. But that doesn't mean that people want to live in a shared environment. So that's the alternative, right? Yeah. So how do you, you know, how do you reconcile that? And I would say for number 2, absolutely, I feel that services should be in or nearby, and that they have to be accessible, because then we have the whole system of becoming homeless again, right? The reentry of in and out this cyclical or chronic homelessness. And I think that the services have to be accessible in order to help increase the probability of that not happening. And I don't know the answer to number 3. I did have a question for anybody who, this idea of housing first, and I know one of the last meetings, I think we talked about that, and the model that was used in Houston and Seattle. I've just been reading about those, and I wondered if those are really workable solutions in our area. It seems like we're a much more expensive place than both of those areas. And I'm not sure that it really is feasible to focus on housing first and do everything we can to just get people off the streets. But I'd be curious, maybe not at this meeting, but material that somebody could send out later to talk about how is that possible? Is it possible to take that approach in solving the homelessness or solving this problem here?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I know that there are at least 4 or 5 people on this call who are just raring to go and talk about housing first. I'm going to take first crack. As facilitator, I have that power. I would say, so one of the things that Homebase gets to work with a lot of the providers in the community on, and the county on, is as a community strengthening our housing first approach. So housing first very much is an approach and a philosophy that our system of care takes and embraces and uses. So absolutely, housing first is a possible approach, and it's an existing approach in our community. So just for folks to get us all on the same page, when we say housing first, we mean the idea that in order to address the barriers that people face to stability in housing, it is so much easier and more effective and has a significantly higher success rate to work on supporting people with those things once they're stably housed. So the idea of housing first is that we don't have to have someone wait to be ready for housing. Everybody is ready to live inside once they say they're ready to live inside. And then, but not everybody has the tools, the resources, the social support, the income to maintain housing on their own. And so the rest of the story about housing first, it's not just housing, it's housing first. And then what does this individual person or household need in order to get to a place where they're stable in that housing and are not going to lose it again? And now I'm going to bow out and let other folks who are much smarter take a crack. Go ahead, Hillary.
I'm definitely not smarter than you, Eli, but I think that, and you might be talking about the program in Austin called Community First. And so for those who are not familiar, it's basically a tiny house community.
We've lost your audio, Hillary. She won't know that until the computer catches up with her.
No. How about now?
Go for
Yeah,
it.
we can hear you now.
We're good.
Sorry. Bad bandwidth. So so it's a tiny house community focused on building community among the residents there. And I think that one of the challenges in developing a community that's an exact replica of that is that land use becomes difficult. They have a lot of land in Austin and can spread farther, and so it's a less efficient use of land. And I think that what we can gain from the model and what some of our providers are trying to do is use that same community building philosophy, but in more dense development. So with our supportive housing developments, how can the team build a sense of everyone being part of something? And I think that when people become unhoused, that's one of the most impactful things they lose, is a sense of belonging to the community, because I think it feels a lot like rejection after rejection. So I think that there's a lot of goodness that we can learn and replicate in terms of service delivery. I think that when we consider land use efficiency, that's where those types of communities become harder. Also, to visit back on the question of how many bedrooms, I think there's always a shortage of smaller units, like studios and 1 bedrooms, because when those types of units are in the regular rental market, they're the lowest cost. And so they're grabbed up and either by like an appropriate household size or by folks doubling up. So I'm always an advocate of smaller units. And I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Cool. So Andrea, I see your hand, and then I'm going to take us back to the discussion questions, but go ahead, Andrea.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry, Lulu wanted to say something. She cut me off earlier. But I did want to address the housing first portion, and I think Vivian could agree with me on this, because I know both Home First and Abode really focus on the housing first model. It's part of our philosophy and the tenets that we use. So what we do know is that housing first works. And we know it because we have data from across the nation. Various different communities have tried it. People get housed. Over time, believe it or not, before services are even provided, many of the folks who are placed in a housing first environment actually are able to stabilize, and their mental acuity increases and their physical health also increases. So this happens over a period of time without services, and then you add services on, and it's even better for everybody involved. So we do know that housing first works. And thank you for looking at the research on that. I think that's a really great thing to do.
Excellent. So we have about 10 minutes left for this portion of the conversation. So I want to, if you have burning questions about affordable housing or supportive housing development, please ask. But I want to sort of gently direct our attention back to some of these discussion questions that we started with. Any thoughts based on experience, based on what you've heard here about what sort of apartment sizes should be focused on, what the approach should be when making those decisions? What types of programs or services might be most important to be located inside or near extremely low income housing? And then what sort of approaches or strategies or just ideas for how interim or supportive housing developments can be good neighbors over the long term in communities? Thoughts on any of those questions? Go ahead, Greg.
Hi, thanks, Eli. Just a couple of things I would note. I know we've brought a lot of attention to 3311 Kiefer, or I guess it's been redesignated 2904 Corvin. I don't know if that's like a rebranding we're doing, but there are, housing is critical, and we all know that. It's just not humane way of living to live in the creeks or in a lean-to or a tent or something anywhere else. But I think it is important to recognize some of the potential impacts, because like Kiefer, for instance, week to week is one of the top calls for service generators for both police and fire, if not the number one, week to week. But with that, it should be kind of expected, right? The alternative is if we, you can point to that one location and say calls for service. But if we don't have the housing, then those calls for service are just spread throughout, the creeks and the businesses and everything else. So I think there is a give and take there, and certainly the police department recognizes that. One of the things that we've had at 3311 Kiefer on the Good Neighbor involved with that business or that entity. There was one example of they were calling police frequently to come out and do mental health, like welfare checks. And we kind of had to educate them on why that's not the best approach to go in on some situations, where we don't want to, go in and, help us help you kind of a thing. Right. And we actually got them like kind of redirected towards a better, more mental health focused approach, or we use our crisis intervention specialists. So, without having those open discussions, they wouldn't have known like a better way of handling that. So I think it's critical when we have these. The two things from the police department standpoint is we need to anticipate there is going to be an increased calls for service. No doubt, the data shows it. But we just advocate for like hiring more police officers, more first responders to kind of like, counteract that balance. And at the same time, have open discussions, even if there's a mechanism, make it mandatory when these are built, like, there needs to be regular meetings with, all of your public safety entities so that we can keep the lines of communication open, and try to, help people the best way possible.
Yeah. Thanks. Awesome. Okay. Vivian, go for it.
I realize I have spoken, so if there's someone else that wants to speak, I want to give opportunity.
Yeah, let me be a good facilitator and say, is there anyone who hasn't gotten a chance to share during this conversation and has thoughts or questions? Thoughts about types of affordable housing, how the city should be focused on this? What populations you see who might be particularly in need of affordable housing that haven't been mentioned yet? Okay, Vivian, go for it.
Well, I could talk the whole time. So people will get sick of hearing me. They'll want to say something, I'm sure. So I just want to, echo or talk about the comments on from the sergeant on police calls, and just be real with folks that the first year and a half, sometimes 2 years of a deeply supportive building is a challenging building. You have a lot of people moving in all together, new staff, new neighbors, sometimes, beat officers change as well. So it is, there are more police calls than average. However, we've been doing permanent supportive housing for decades. That is not constant throughout the life of a project. So that is usually, the first year or two as the apartments stabilize, that, there are more until folks understand how to use emergency response and understand how to access services. So I do want to say that. I think in the notes to your more specific questions, Eli, what type of programs, one of the things that we struggle to balance with is for permanent supportive housing. Remember, there's all sorts of different people living in a building. So we really like to mix formerly homeless folks with, other just general low income folks. So, as mentioned, a lot of a good amount of the formerly homeless folks are disabled. They're severely disabled. So there's a lot of like, get them a job and have them go to work. Well, a lot of them have been homeless for 20, 30 years. They're older adults often, and so sometimes the services, to them might be reuniting with family, reconnecting with the community, definitely getting their healthcare needs met, absolutely. But the general low income units will certainly working with them on income, employment, enhancing income, stability in other ways, helping their families with school and that sort of thing. So it really, the types of services really depend on who's in that building, and it changes over time. Kids get older, and it's long-term housing. So you might have kids programming, and it turns into teen programming. So 10 years down the road. So you just have to cater to the building, which changes over time.
Okay. So we've got about 4 minutes before we switch over and start giving you a summary of what we've heard from the community so far. So this is a call for last thoughts, best thoughts around affordable housing. And just as y'all are thinking, I'm going to vamp a little bit. So think about what do you want to be on the metaphorical table for our next conversation at our last meeting, where we're going to ask you all to think about some of all the ideas that have come up over all of these conversations, and to prioritize those ideas and express which ones you think you would recommend being in a city plan. So is there any other thoughts you want to share or recommendations you want to propose?
Don't cringe, Adam, but has the city thought about an ADU program?
And ADU is accessory dwelling unit, which means a dwelling unit that is located on the plot of a single family home, correct?
And can you elaborate a little bit, Hillary? Are you meaning for where a homeowner would build an ADU and then rent it out to someone who's formerly homeless?
Yes.
Okay.
And sorry, Eli, I missed everything that you said because I froze again. Or even like, I mean, it doesn't have to be a formerly homeless person. It could be like an ELI person that is housed, or a senior on SSI, where they would be, like maybe they get a subsidy to help build it, and then they have the same sort of affordability restriction that we'd put on any other development. Like, because the thing is, like, more housing helps us. Mm-hmm. The right kind of housing is better, but any more housing helps us.
Yeah, we did a little. Oh.
In a lot of places.
Yeah, no, we did a little bit of that discussion internally, especially when we're talking about the housing element and sort of the big picture of housing in Santa Clara, not just, and ADUs is definitely part of the larger strategy. We did talk with Suzanne Isa, who's now a planner in Santa Cruz County, and they have an ADU program where the county pays homeowners, but requires restrictions, and it's been pretty tough to run the program. She said, because ADUs are so spread out, and because homeowners are not professional landlords, it's just a really challenging program to operate and very expensive. And so I think if it was going to happen, and I don't mean to push this back on the county, but I feel like it would need to be a regional program. Like there would need to be some larger regional entity that's training homeowners to be landlords, those who want to be, assuming that there's a market for that. And then making sure that they're charging the right rents and that things are going well. And that would require, you know, a decent amount of legwork and staff time. And I just don't think individual cities, it makes sense for individual cities to do that because the scale is so much smaller than building 80 to 100 units at a time. And then, you know, I think Vivian could probably speak to the efficiency of managing an apartment building versus one here and one a mile away in another neighborhood. It's just really challenging.
You should tell Natalie at the next housing coordination meeting that one of your task force members had a brilliant suggestion, but you recommended.
I'm going to go to Lori for our last comment before we switch topics.
There you go. So, yeah, it's really hard sometimes to be transparent, you know.
Lori, we're not getting your
I
audio.
started when I was 13 years old. I was a preschooler.
Lori, your audio is, yeah, that might help. Still not hearing you.
Can you hear me now? No?
Yes.
Okay, so let's try it. So I'm going to try to be really quick. So I think my question was a little bit answered, but just being transparent, I've worked my entire life. Recently, though, 6 years ago, I had to, as a lot of you know, I had to leave due to some domestic violence after raising my 3 kids, my 3 grandkids. And by God's grace and his mercy, you know, I met somebody who became my best friend, and that together we decided to raise his son, you know, but there's going to be a time when we part, you know, and for us, we came into a big family home here in Santa Clara. The rent's almost $4,000 a month. About 2 years ago, actually, no, just a year and a half ago, I got approved for SSDI. I've had like 20 surgeries, lots of medical things going on, but you won't see it in my face and I don't complain about it, but that's where I'm at. So if I was by myself, like embarrassingly, like how I'm so embarrassed because working my whole life here in the Bay Area, but having nothing to show for it because of circumstances that happen, it's really hard. But because we moved into this big giant house, there was actually 2 families. The other family went crazy. We had to get them out. So it was just us trying to pay rent here. So my question was that, you know, you have to be homeless to get help. So we literally almost were, and due to COVID-19, we had some issues, but we were gracefully, you know, had some rent paid, but the landlord took that as a, like, how dare you? And then as soon as they got paid, they gave us a 60-day notice. And we freaked out because, I mean, I have, you know, we just didn't know what we were going to do. But we talked to them. We said, hey, can you please try to work with us? Even though I'm on a fixed income, the other party doesn't make anything what we should make here, being born and raised here. And so we still barely don't even make rent sometimes. And we have to like do different things to try to get it together for that month. So my question was, you know, is there a program where you can keep people in houses rather than get evicted that doesn't take, you know, 30 days to get approved? Because I remember when the COVID-19 stuff happened, somebody said like they'd help you for some months, but they didn't. They just passed, you know, the pass run, which we were super grateful for. And, you know, it helped us have savings account and paid our savings account, and now we ran out of the savings account again, you know. So it's like one of those catch-22. So that was the biggest question, but I get what Adam says about, you know, having all that going.
Yeah, great. I think great question, Laura. So I'm hearing what I think what you're getting at is prevention. It's someone is not yet unhoused, but really needs support immediately in order to stay housed. Can I ask another task force member to speak to the prevention and what that looks like now? Prevention resources available. I know we've been making Hillary do a lot of work, but
I got this. I'm gonna put myself off video though, so I don't freeze. There is a homeless prevention system who can help provide guidance and resources. And to access that, you can go to preventhomelessness.org and you'll find the information for Santa Clara County's homelessness prevention system.
You can also call one of the providers directly, like Home First Services has a housing problem solving program. And it's one-time assistance to support. But please give us a call at our main number and we can do what we can to support you in the moment.
You know, Andrea, that beautiful little boy you saw, we literally in 2018 spent 2 nights in the car because we lost our home because of, you know, them not wanting to work with us over there. You know, we stayed in hotels for 6 months and we made it. He didn't know he was homeless, but you know, we made it fun. We made it exciting, you know, and people look at my life and you wouldn't know that, you know, you wouldn't, because you don't on Facebook that kind of stuff because it's embarrassing. But knowing what I've done in this world, like I know that I deserve more than what I have now, you know. So it's one of those things where I would rather help people more than help myself, like in this type of an area and just go like paycheck to paycheck and month to month, and it's scary. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Also, if you have available rooms to rent, please make sure that you say that and connect to one of our housing specialists, because we do place people in shared living environments all the time. And so it can help you make your rent and it can help somebody who's got an extremely low income, you know, survive. That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And Lori, thank you as always for being very generous with your experience and raising some really important issues and questions. Okay, we are going to transition away a little bit to share with you some of the input and the information and the suggestions that we've gotten through various aspects of the community engagement process that we've been working on jointly with some of the task force members and the city. So we're going to share what we've heard from a number of different types of input. We're going to hear about a city staff focus group. We're going to report out on some of the input and sort of expertise and knowledge we've gained from our lived experience focus groups and outreach. And we're going to debrief the community forum and talk about some takeaways from that meeting. So first, I'm going to throw back to our wonderful city partners.
Thanks, Eli. Yes, so a few weeks ago, we met with our colleagues in various departments across the city. So police, fire, parks and recreation, libraries, community development, which includes housing, planning and building, and also public works. And you know, we got some really great feedback. Next slide. One of the things that we heard, and again, some of these staff people are kind of frontline in the sense that whereas I sit in an office and look at computers all day, librarians, police officers, firefighters are literally outdoors in the field, face to face with the public every day. And so the folks that are out in those types of jobs are noticing more people. More interactions with people with severe mental illness and substance abuse issues, or both. And there's some sort of concerns that staff is not equipped or trained to know how to approach some of those situations. And in some cases, there's legitimate concerns about safety at work, you know, especially in the evenings, going to your car, things like that. There was one example given. There was a suggestion or that there needs to really be more outreach to our point, and another kind of plug to our conversation a few meetings ago, and specifically maybe with social workers, people that are trained to work with and build relationships and rapport over time with people who are suffering from mental illness and possibly struggling with substance abuse. There was also an acknowledgement that Santa Clara lacks a one-stop service provider like Sunnyvale Community Services, which may provide. It's actually something we're planning to go do a field trip to go visit and understand their operations a little bit better. The sense that you could go one place to get case management, to get clothes, to get food, potentially even a place to sleep. There are navigation centers now in San Francisco, Fremont, and other places. So there really isn't anything like that in the city of Santa Clara. There are some things, but it's just not easy to get them all in one place. Next slide. There's also a need. I think what we're doing right now and what we've been doing with this task force and this broader process is building this communication. As I think we've all learned, this is incredibly complicated. There's so many people working on so many different parts of this issue, and it's just really hard to stay in constant communication and to know that Home First provides housing specialists, for example. Like, I didn't know that's something they could do is shared living arrangements, and I wish I had known that last night when I was speaking to the Planning Commission. So I think there's a need for ongoing communication, and we're all busy, so we can't all be in meetings all the time. So I think, how do you be efficient with communication and be intentional between all these different levels within the city departments, between the city and the county, between the city and nonprofit and service providers, et cetera. There's also some comments about increased trash and bio waste, graffiti, fires, vandalism at different facilities in the city, and that is the city staff is diligently addressing those and fixing them as they happen, but it is happening, and those do have costs associated with them. There is, Sergeant Deeger, feel free to jump in here on the second to last bullet if you want to cover that one since you're here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess first I'll just kind of elaborate. I know on one point, we're talking about workers that, not necessarily just police and fire, but like parks and recreation employees, public works, et cetera. They're the danger that they're perceived. It's not perceived. It's real. We're having incidents in Central Park where they have like outdoor yoga sessions, and you have aggressive male subjects experiencing homelessness that are exposing themselves to people. They're carrying weapons. I'm literally texting with one of my officers right now who just there was a person with a felony warrant that was out in Central Park. It's real, to the point of limited accountability. And I think we might have touched on.
We lost your audio for just a second, Greg. Might want to go back mid-sentence.
Sorry about that. I think can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I was just talking about the limited accountability for crime. There's a lot of factors that have played into that. About 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was Proposition 47, Proposition 57, AB 109. These are things that were passed by California voters, and they decriminalized a lot of crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. And I think we probably talked about it. We certainly did during the community forum, but you had, say, like a drug offense would have carried a potential prison sentence. And then you could get somebody, it was easier to convince somebody, I'm speaking in generalities here, but convince them to go to drug rehabilitation as an alternative to prison. Whereas now if they get a citation, it's like, do you want to go to drug rehab and do the hard work, or do you want a piece of paper that you can throw away? And you can kind of guess what the choice usually is. Additionally, during the pandemic, the county did a $0 bail, which took a lot of crimes. And we're not talking, there was certainly low level, but things like, drug dealing, like on large scales, weapons possession, people were being released on $0 bail. And so, for a long time, not saying this was the right way to do things, but, there was more repercussions for criminal activity. When the cops come in and arrest somebody, they would kind of go to jail, and they might be there for a while. And of course, like that's not targeting the homeless, that's just all throughout society, but that does certainly include people who are experiencing homelessness. So you would have, you know, maybe it's less in your face in years past, whereas now all of these things are kind of combining to where if you do arrest somebody, they're likely going to be released very soon and be right back in the position that they were, you know, in some cases, like just simply hours later. And that certainly, like, you know, compounds things.
Thanks, Sergeant. And just to sort of wrap up this section, the last thing that we heard was just, you know, that, you know, the ability to do more and to create new programs. So if this plan creates new programs and new partnerships, you know, the city, you know, in order to do more, it's constrained by its budget, and there'll be a need to think about, you know, where will those resources come from to potentially hire new people, and or you know, outsource, you know, certain services as we do with the mobile shower laundry, which I can talk about later on. And with that, I'll hand it right back to Eli.
Awesome. I did want to leave a little bit of space. We're not going to be able to leave too much space for follow-up questions because we have a couple other share outs from other community engagement, but I wanted to leave a little space for, you know, burning questions, follow-up questions, thoughts on the city focus group feedback. And Lori, I see your hand up, but I think it's from a previous. Okay. Then I see Greg, I see your hand.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to mention before we move on from the comments from city staff. You know, I can't say strongly enough how deeply this is affecting city staff, and they're not alone. I mean, we literally had one of our employees that was on the focus group reduced to tears from frustration and fear in one of the parks, which is pretty bad, in my opinion, kind of unacceptable. And they're not alone. You know, I know in a very public forum like this, sometimes it's difficult to voice not necessarily the opposition, but just kind of some of the realities of the situation. It can invite some you know, scorn or sideways looks, right? But I think to come up with solutions, we really do have to be real about some of this that's going on. There's a lot of, again, not necessarily in a public forum like this, but I get flooded with emails from individuals who feel safe, you know, emailing the police department, sharing a lot of the experiences that back up what our employees are experiencing kind of on the front lines. And there's, you know, I think definitely increasing outreach teams, definitely increasing the mental health component of it is going to be huge. And what I'm saying is just for us to kind of put in the back of our minds when we're coming up with potential recommendations, is that there's also a segment though of this population that, you know, just like any other segment of the population, but we're obviously talking about specifically homeless, where you can't actually even begin to have that rapport building because you can't have a productive conversation. I'm not kidding. We literally this past week went to somebody who was experiencing a rash, and they rubbed their own feces over it, thinking that was going to be a home remedy. And it's very difficult to try to establish some sort of rapport or a meaningful conversation with somebody like that. So there's people that are in the mental health realm of things that are kind of falling into a gap, and it's something that we definitely need to kind of chew on. There isn't a mechanism to force them. Sometimes you can get to the point where you're not articulable as gravely disabled according to the law, but you clearly need some sort of mental health resources, and we can't place that person on a hold to get them there. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing a lot of in the parks with the folks that are experiencing homelessness that have kind of congregated in the park, Central Park being a glaring example, where there's some very clear mental health issues. They think they're secret agents for various government entities. You know, they're talking to their own reflections, things like that. And that's, I think, for me, from my experiences being on the front lines, because that's who we respond to a lot. That's the segment of the population that we really kind of got to like make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks, because those are kind of the toughest ones to tackle.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing those experiences, Greg. Appreciate it. Hillary, I see your hand.
two thoughts towards recommendations for addressing some of these things. One is, I wonder if there's an opportunity to partner with Destination Home and or the Lived Experience Advisory Board on some education or partnership with city staff or interested community members about engagement related to unhoused people. And I say that because I feel like when definitely like the element of crime and safety we need to like address and guide people in a way, but I think that even just the idea of meeting people with lived experience and understanding like the mindset that they were in when they were in that experience, that for better or worse resulted in criminal activity, I think is really powerful, and like to build that relationship. And then the other recommendation that I would have us think about is perhaps there's an opportunity for the city to fund or to contribute to the county-wide pot for like we call it the homelessness, it's the HEAT team. Vivian, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's like an emergency outreach team, or some sort of like partnership for outreach with the PD. Because I think that that's where, like what I hear you saying, Sergeant Digger, is like, we're here to respond to the safety issue. We need a partner who understands the mental health crisis that's happening in front of us.
I mean, just a quick clarification. I think we definitely understand it. And, you know, I think I've explained, you know, months and months ago, the community response team that I supervise actually includes two crisis intervention specialists who are specially trained in mental health. I literally just yesterday, not a pat on the back, but myself and one of the CIS guys, we talked a gal from jumping off the roof of SCU. We definitely understand the mental health picture, and we take it very seriously. And it's literally hundreds and hundreds of hours to that end. What my part of the mental health kind of concern is that there are there's different degrees, right? Of course, and every case is kind of complex, but what we're seeing is, and this is where a lot of our refusals for services come from, it's not so much, you know, and I'm just my own experiences, right? But it's not so much somebody who's clear of mind and they're afraid of the cops. We never see fear. We're plain clothes. We don't wear uniforms. We're incredibly friendly. You guys should come out and come along with me. I'll take you out. You see what we do and how we do it. It's the segment that, again, is like, isn't to the point where they're gravely disabled legally, but they clearly cannot make an educated decision for themselves. When you're, you know, talking about spaceships, or you're a secret agent for something, or again, you're rubbing feces all over your body, you can't even begin to have a conversation about directing someone towards resources. And then because of some of the limitations that we have placed on us, we have, you know, the case law of Martin versus Boise, where, you know, it's anything that is a rule or regulation that would criminalize an activity that's a natural consequence of homelessness is unconstitutional. So if we get someone set up in the park and they're living there and in a tent, and we used to have a regulation in the city against like overnight camping, that's no longer enforceable, right? So now this person's here, but we also have to weigh the concerns of the public who wants to come in, and the Arbor, for instance, is a rentable space, and they pay $100, you know, an hour or whatever to rent this space to do, you know, wakes or birthday parties or whatever. But when they arrive, they have somebody who's set up and who's living there. In fact, a small little community, and the police department doesn't have a mechanism to get those folks to move. The residents are upset because this is unacceptable. There's also some of these folks, again, have warrants or doing, you know, some indecent exposure type things, whatever. And when we try to go the services route and try to get them connected with various resources, then it's, you know, again, some of these like mental obstacles that aren't so easily overcomable. They're really hard to even start to have a conversation. And that right there, that is what we're seeing all throughout the city. That is the friction point. It's the source of frustration for us as police, because we want to solve problems. We want to make everybody whole, no matter what your life circumstance is. But we really are kind of stuck in a very difficult position with not a whole lot of answers because some of the limitations that have been placed on us.
I'm gonna go, so we are going to move on from this conversation because we really want to share pieces of other input, but I'm gonna go to Andrea and then Adam.
Thanks, Eli. I'll make it brief. So in partnership with Momentum for Mental Health and Pacific Clinics, Home First is now operating what we're calling the Trust Team. I believe it's going to be rolling out late September. The number to call is 988, I believe. I'll get clarity on that for everyone, but it is a mobile crisis response program that is county-wide, North County, Middle County, and then South County, 24/7. So, in the near future, we will have a phone number that you can call. And if there is a behavioral crisis or somebody misbehaving in a way that you feel they need some kind of mental health intervention, the public will now be able to dial this number and we will respond versus the police department. So we're really excited about that. And Sergeant Digger, I would love to go out with you and your team. I think what you're doing is fabulous work and we need more of that. So thank you, everybody. I'll be quiet.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I feel the same. So we're really lucky to have Sergeant Digger and his team. Not every city has that. But what I wanted to say was two things. One was, I wanted to ask Andrea and other folks, when you have an extreme case of somebody who really has very severe mental illness, what is the right housing solution? So in other words, are there instances where even PSH isn't the appropriate place for somebody to be? And what, if not, where is that place?
So Vivian and I know Vivian can speak to this. We have a little different approach, but I agree with her wholeheartedly. There are some folks with the current design of PSH services that will not be successful in that environment because they need more. One of the approaches is to look at the service delivery model in PSH environments and make the necessary changes so that there are more significant touch points, more regularity, more availability, more access. And Vivian has some great ideas on that. I also believe that even with that, I don't think that all situations work for everybody and that we need a continuum of services. And so, emergency interim housing is something that I'm a huge supporter of. I think these congregate sites are phenomenal. They're dignified, they're clean, they don't increase crime, they don't lower property values. When run properly, they're extremely successful, and they can be permanent housing for groups of people like seniors on fixed incomes or SSI. Who can live in these safe environments in a sense of community and still have their own unit and their own bathroom. So I think PSH is a phenomenal solution for most people, but we really do need to take a look at redesigning the service delivery package. And I'll hand it off to Vivian.
Yeah, everything that she said, I totally agree with. That I look at it in what I call sort of a different type of progressive engagement. So I believe that, we're really bad at determining on the face of it how well people do in housing. You think that someone's going to do really poorly, and then they go in and they're amazing. Someone else you think it has it all together, they go in and they don't do well at all. So we always try permanent supportive housing, as an option, and it really works for like 96% of folks. Nationwide, that's a bode. We've been doing this for years, but that's typical. 96% of the highest need, the most severe, do well. We ran Project Welcome Home, which was taking the tippy top of the users of the mental health care system, the medical system, and throughout the county, the tippy top, and folks maintained housing. So it's possible. I think even beyond what Andrea was saying, sometimes people are so disabled that sometimes they even need a higher level of care, and that's sometimes like a board and care situation in which it's a setting where they have other needs taken care of on a day-to-day. It's almost like it's not quite skilled nursing. It's but sometimes people are so medically fragile that at a certain point they can no longer live independently. And I'm sure Hillary can talk to this. That's another sort of lack in the community, because these are really, really expensive to maintain. Lot that are like privately owned. A lot of older people who have them are now retiring or passing them on. So that sort of level of care is also needed, but for not as many people as you think. Even the folks that the sergeant's talking about that are super hard to engage with, most of those people, with active engagement, a lot of it, eventually say yes to housing and do pretty well, but you do have to catch them at a time where they can say yes. It takes a long time sometimes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. We want to share quickly some of the feedback that we heard from some other sources. So I'm going to pass to one of my colleagues to quickly go through some of the things that we heard as we spoke to people with lived experience being unhoused.
Great. Thanks, Eli. So as part of our community engagement process, we did conduct 2 on-site opportunities for people with lived experience of homelessness to share their experiences using services in the community, barriers to housing in the city, and for them to provide feedback on what has worked well and what can be improved. So we held brief one-on-one surveys at St. Justin's Community Ministries Food Pantry. So specifically what came from that location was that folks would like more locations for meals, showers, and laundry services, and that it would be helpful to have these resources in locations near other sources. But facilities like St. Justin's are helpful to fill gaps when folks are running low on other benefits or unable to make ends meet. And some folks also reported a lack of clarity surrounding what resources are available. So they recommended not only having more services, but having services openly advertised so that folks know when things are available and where to access them. People also expressed a need for more shelter, and one of those suggestions was to repurpose empty buildings that aren't being used so that people have a place to sleep, including supports like trash pickup and security. As well, the #1 barrier to obtaining housing that multiple people highlighted was affordability. So some suggestions for that included adjustments to zoning and other red tape to allow for more affordable housing development. And in general, people would like to see more of the city's resources put towards building housing. And then on the next slide, we have some feedback from Covenant House. So we held a focus group with youth and young adults that are currently in the program. And from this focus group, we heard that youth are interested in seeing more spaces and options to network, find jobs, and increase their income. So here several people expressed interest in personalized support to identify and grow a skill set, and opportunities to attend trade schools or participate in apprenticeships, and also having employers who are currently hiring visit places like Covenant House to allow for more accessibility to jobs. And similar to St. Justin's, Covenant House youth identified affordability is the biggest issue to tackle, citing that young adults are having to work multiple jobs in order to stay afloat, and all of the cost of living expenses on top of rent contribute to the affordability crisis for individuals trying to maintain housing. Specifically, not having credit is a barrier for young adults who are trying to focus on daily expenses, and also lack that support to build a strong foundation financially. Folks also observed the impacts of substance use daily in terms of seeing people struggle with addiction in the community, and they would like to see rehabilitation for people experiencing homelessness who are using, as well as recognizing that substance use impacts youth specifically who are trying to find options for income. So at times, selling drugs becomes only one of the only options for youth to survive and also have a place to live. But ultimately, the group highlighted a need for greater community support and recommended bringing services to where people in need are located as to make them more accessible. So making sure that young adults and people have options and support was raised as the primary preventative strategy to keep people from experiencing homelessness. And with that, I will turn it over to some of our task force members who attended as facilitators to our community forum event to share their reflections. So Anne, would you like to start us off and we can just move down the list?
Sure, thanks. We had a group of about 9 people in our session, and it was really helpful. I think one of the big things that the group felt was it was good to have such a gathering and to talk with one another about what ideas they had or what are the impacts of homelessness in the community. So just the idea that there was an opportunity to get together and hear and talk with one another was a really valuable thing. And we did hear that they would like to continue doing that. So more opportunities to have these conversations is something that they would like. Also, the shared housing solutions came up. I mentioned that earlier. Ways to capitalize or leverage housing that's already out there, and how do we take advantage of that so that folks who are unhoused might have places to go and think creatively around housing. Of course, the expense of housing, folks said we need to figure out how to support mechanisms to provide funds so people can get into the rental market because it's so difficult. Others said, how do we get rid of the stigma of homelessness, and how do we help people get back on track? Things about that was question number 1, I think, were some of the big areas. For question 2, about how do you prioritize to reduce the impact? One of the folks was the visibility and accessibility of food pantries. How do we make things available to folks so that they can get access to them, and when encampments aren't close by? So how do we help with getting food and things to the folks in encampments? What else? Better public education about who unhoused people are, and inviting the stories. And I think Michelle on this task force has shared stories and about experiences, and that's what our little group felt was really important, is how do we learn about the folks who are unhoused and to see what the needs are. Services should be near transportation. That was something else that people felt was important. And I think just need to be innovative about how to get basic services to folks who are unhoused. And I think that those were the big highlights. Joy, you might have something more to add.
No, that was perfect, I think. Thanks, Anne. And I think Hillary was next.
Thanks, Joy. I think that, a couple of things in the group stood out to me. One is that everyone who participated in the group that I helped facilitate was very interested in being part of the solution and didn't know how. And so I think that as we come up with recommendations, I think it would be really great for us to have recommendations that include how community members and residents of the city can help with solving the problem. I think related to that, there was discussion in the group about how when people express their concerns about housing development coming up, I think that the group provided some opportunities and some insight about what the causes and the reasons were for people's.
Oh, we lost you, Hillary. Nope. I'm sorry, Hillary, we lost your audio, and for time, in
Yep.
the final minutes of it. Oh, you're back.
I am back. Property values was the number one obvious one. And that's actually all I was going to say, is that I think that there was a lot of great feedback about opportunities and ideas for the education that we need to provide to people, and that we need to give people a way to help.
All right. Thanks for that. And we have Lori next.
Okay, well, a lot of our people had a lot of the same things that the other gals have talked about. One of the things that I'll never forget was a sweet elderly man said, well, what about having a face to people that are homeless? Because he was really interested, but want to help, but they just don't know, how to get involved, and maybe putting a face to, to different people who might be homeless, right? Thing was, we learned from the mayor that there was a project over there on Monroe Street, and everybody was so surprised how the community reacted very negatively to them building that building, which I think you all know what I'm talking about. But anyways, that was one thing was talked about. And other than that, yeah, we're losing it. Okay, so anyway, everything is pretty much the same. It was awesome. We loved it.
Eli, you're muted now.
Yes, because I think I am not presenting the community forum key takeaways, but I did need to share the screen again for my colleagues.
Thank you, Eli. So I will briefly go over some of the key takeaways and the themes. A lot of this is already said by our three wonderful co-facilitators. So, community education was something that you just heard folks talked about a lot. Kind of what Hillary said, give people a way to help. A lot of people really just wanted to know, felt like the community could really benefit from, knowing what homelessness actually looks like, what resources are out there, and particularly what are the reasons that people end up unhoused, and having these conversations that, folks felt like would be really helpful. The next thing we heard a lot is that folks want to see things that address the impacts of unsheltered homelessness. So some ideas included providing garbage bins by creeks and throughout the city, increasing access to public restrooms and mobile showers, improving the quality of life for people that are unsheltered, increasing access to behavioral health services was kind of a part of that too. We also really heard a lot of folks talk about the need to increase the supply of housing and services that are within the city's control, especially those that are extremely low income and truly affordable units, and how to do that by exploring more inclusionary housing policy, utilizing motels and hotels to convert into transitional housing, and using resources that are already existing but maybe not being fully utilized. Another thing we heard was that that was addressed by community members was the need to address hesitancy to accept services, which is something that Sergeant Dager did touch on, particularly in instances where an individual is significantly impaired by mental health or substance use condition, and kind of exploring ways to ensure that these folks receive psychiatric assessment and other resources. Another resounding theme we heard was the need for more localized services within the city and that are available to people in the city. And then lastly, there was a lot of mention of really targeting housing and services to vulnerable subpopulations like survivors of domestic violence, LGBTQ youth, and then older adults, which folks say is this population that they're seeing an increase of homelessness in the homeless population in the city of Santa Clara, folks that are on fixed income or maybe lost their housing when they were older and may not be able to have employment and are limited there. And so that's it. Those are the key takeaways. So we can move on to the next slide.
Unfortunately, we are at 7:59. So Adam, I'm gonna scroll through these slides and just take us to our wrap up. Okay, thanks for that.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you, Eli. So next slide. So we talked about this a little bit earlier in the process update, but just as a reminder, we have one more task force meeting left, and we're planning to take the month of September off and convene in October. So the date is on the slide there, Thursday, October 27th, the same time, 6 to 8, and you can register on the city's homelessness task force webpage. Of course, if you have any questions, you can contact Homebase at City of Santa Clara at homebaseccc.org or 415-788-7961. And just as a reminder, on October 27th, we're going to discuss what the task force sees as priorities for the city's plan and what strategies or action steps should be recommended to be included. And then the city and Homebase are going to work on putting together a draft plan based on these recommendations. And then there will be community input with the goal of having a draft plan to be shared at the public hearings in the fall. So yeah, thank you all for being here. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night. And we really look forward to our October task force meeting.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks you all.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Thanks everyone so much.